Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Pesachim Samach. Okay, today's daf is sponsored by Becky Goldstein in loving memory of her mother, Rose Fram, Shoshana Rosa Bat Shmuel, and Minda Leah Zichrona Levracha, a self-made woman who received her high school leaving certificate at the age of 50. She persisted in trudging through snow and ice-trodden streets to join any shiur. Her greatest quality was her desire and ability after each speaker ended to rise and eloquently express her appreciation on behalf of the audience. This is a lesson that was transmitted to her children and grandchildren, thus inculcating values and ideals set forth in our Torah of Ben Adam L'Chavero, Yehi Zichra Baruch. And by Blima Shtorchian Slutsky in memory of her father, Yitzchak Tzvi ben Blima and Chaim Shimon Zichrono Levracha. We are now going to get started. We're going to finish the 5th parak today. And we're going to move on to the new parak, which is going to continue very similarly to things we saw in this chapter. If you thought we were getting out of Korbanot, we're in it for the next while. Okay, we're going to start from the very top of the page. I'll just quickly review the last thing we did because it's a little bit in the middle. We finished with the question about how do we know, and I mentioned yesterday that a lot of the sacrifices, the details are not mentioned in the Torah explicitly. They give you a bunch of details and other details are mentioned in other sacrifices, and it's always a question, where do we learn the missing details from? Do we learn it from this sacrifice? Do we learn it from the other sacrifice? Do you do it this way? Do you do it that way? So here also, it doesn't say exactly how you're supposed to put the blood on the altar. Many sacrifices, all sacrifices that are made from animals have some sort of blood going on the altar. It just varies what you do, whether you pour it, sprinkle it, spill it, okay, different types. So, or throw it, kind of zrika. So by us, we have zrika. How do we know the Pesach is bizrika? It doesn't say so in the Pasuk. So they learned it out from Bechor, because by Bechor, it used plural when it talked about the bloods. So therefore, they assume whatever it said there is about the way they did the bloods there is the way they do the bloods here. And the word bloods included Pesach and also Maaser Behema, the 10th of each animal. Then the Torah said, well, the Gemara said, how do we know that it has to be, one of the things it said in the Mishnah, has to be by the sides where there's a base, by the Yesod, where there's this little part that juts out. It went out in Amma from the Mizbeach at the bottom, the altar. How do you know it has to be over there? So they said, we learned from the Korban Ola. So that's what we're left with. And then we say, Va'ola Gufa Minalan. Where do we learn the Korban Ola from? So they say, Amar Kra, Ola Gufa Minalan. Where do we learn that the Ola has to be by the Yesod? So they just say, oh, that's very easy. The verse says so explicitly. El Yesod Mizbach HaOla. It says you're supposed to pour the blood into the Yesod, the base. That's the Yesod. Alma Ola Tuna Yesod. That's how we know it needs to be done by the Yesod of the Mizbech. Okay, going back to now our Kitot. And this is a Gemara we've seen before. Yatzta Kat Rishona. The first kat goes out, right? The second one comes in, second one goes out, the third one comes in. Tana, hinikret kat atzlanit. Say the third one is called the lazy ones. Those who didn't make it into the early ones are considered lazy. So now the Gemara asks the obvious question, V'halo sagi delav hachi, but we just said you have to have 3. So someone has to be in that last group. So they say, right, this is classic. So they say, right, my havalu lemeba, what was he supposed to do? They said he should have tried to be in the early one. In other words, it's true. Someone, right? I keep going back to this. I got my vaccine yesterday, my first dose. So this is in my head, right? Someone's got to get vaccinated last, but it doesn't make a difference. The point is, right? Someone's got to be last, but you should try to make yourselves earlier on the list. Now, obviously, right? This is always a bit of a challenge. On the one hand, you don't want to be pushy, right? This is kind of saying like pushy Israelis, push their way through. But they're saying, in the end, that's the way that we're supposed to be. Certainly when it comes to the Korban Pesach, you should be there first. You shouldn't try to be the last one to get there. Okay, so now they say, and here they bring a famous Braita, Kidditanya, and this we definitely came across before. I can't remember where, and in the Masorah Shas it doesn't quote anywhere that we've already did. So maybe I'm wrong, but I thought we saw this already. The world does not exist without the perfume makers and the tanners. Now, the leather tanners, if you remember, it stinks, it reeks, that smell. So, Ashrei Mishum Monato Basam, Oili Mishum Monato Borsi, right? You don't want to be the Borsi because you end up walking around all your life smelling from it. So, like it's great. The person who's the perfume maker, they always smell beautiful, but the person who's dealing with the smelly stuff, nobody really wants to be that. On the other hand, it's necessary. And here comes the big line. You're not going to be so happy with. The world cannot exist without male and female children. Right? Happy is the one who has male children, even though you need female children, but happy is the one who has female. It's actually, if you translate literally, it translates as whose sons are male, and woe is to those whose sons are females. Okay, now banav is generally a term to mean children in general, but it's actually, you would have thought it would say benotav, whose daughters. But in any case, it's interesting. I think they're bringing this example because I think what they're trying to say is, even if you say maybe we could survive without the tanners, in the end, right, you cannot survive without the females. You might want male children, but you can't end up with male children unless there's females out there. So basically it's trying to say that both are necessary, and it's maybe, and I see, Emma, what you're saying is they balance out. And I think that's exactly what they're saying here, is that there's some sort of balance here, that they work together, and that's what the world is. It's a mix of all these people, but in the end, they're really trying to say, you don't really want to be the one who's bringing the females into the world, or who is the tanners, and you don't want to be the one in that third group who may be necessary, but right, because in the end, remember we said you have to fulfill the verses of Edah Yisrael and Adat Yisrael and Kahal, right? You have to fulfill that, so there has to be someone there, but you don't want to be the one who's there. So it's very interesting. It's a hard Gemara to swallow. But again, it could be they're using it as an extreme example to kind of show, we know you're all happy when you have male sons. And that clearly comes up in the Gemara many times. They really wanted male sons. That was something that was very important to them. Again, hopefully, you can see this with a bit of a cultural perspective, and that this is a little bit different nowadays, or hopefully a lot different. So now we had this interesting thing that we said kind of underlies this tension between possibly the Prushim and the Tzdukim, and how the Kohanim wanted to do things their way, and they wanted to clean. There was all this blood, and today we're going to talk a lot about that blood. There's all this blood in the temple, and they wanted to wash off the floors even on Shabbat. And they did it anyway. Shelo b'ratzon chachamim. The rabbis were not happy with this. So now we're quoting that section, K'maseu b'chol, right? Just like they did in a regular day, everything else was done the same way, right? And now they say Shelo b'ratzon man. Now the Koran has a nice footnote where they say, why is that? Shelo b'ratzon man means who is the one who disagreed with this? And the assumption of the question of the Gemara, which is very different from what Safrai described about what was going on in this Mishnah. Actually, in the Mishnah, there's this tension between the Kohanim or the Tzdukim versus the Prushim, and generally the Chachamim or Prushim, and there was this debate between them. But according to the Gemara, they seem to think it can't be that the Kohanim did anything without the Chachamim's stamp of approval. And therefore, it must be there were some rabbis who disagreed, but not all rabbis. And that's where the sugya starts with. Can't possibly be. They did this against what the rabbi said. Again, when you're in the world of the Amoraim and you're already beyond where there were all those divisions between the Prushim and the Tzdukim, and it wasn't as prominent then, it's harder to understand that kind of tension that went on then. So therefore, the Gemara makes this assumption that it must not have been everyone. So Amar Rav Chisda, Shelo b'ratzon Rabbi Eliezer. It must be that they did it against what Rabbi Eliezer says. Why? Di'i Rabbanan, because if it was the rabbis, ha'amrei shvutu, ve'ein shvut b'bikdash. If you remember, we have this concept, we learned this in Shabbat, that there's no such thing as Rabbanit in the temple, right? Well, it's not exactly true. Okay, well, we'll get to this actually later today also, but that we can override things that are forbidden on a rabbinic level in the temple. So there's a machloket about washing floors on Shabbat. If you remember, we learned this in Masechet Shabbat. According to the rabbis, it's only rabbinic in nature. So when the Kohanim were doing it, it was fine with the rabbi's opinion because it's only forbidden by rabbinic law. But when it comes to Rabbi Eliezer, he holds it's d'oraita. And we're going to see that right now. Because he holds it's d'oraita, so you can't do that in the temple. So therefore, let's read. Where do we see this machloket between them? Tanya, it says in the Braita, okay, the first part doesn't have to do with us. It's talking about milking the cows. Mechabetz and megaben are two processes in the making of cheese. I'm not going to get into the details. There's all different opinions about which parts of the process these are. But basically, cheese making is forbidden if you do it kigrogeret. the size of a fig. If you do it with an amount the size of a fig, it's forbidden. המכבד והמרבץ והרודה חלות דבש בשוגג בשבת חייב חטאת הזי ביום טוב לו כעת 40 דברי רבי אליעזר. So let's start from the end. Rabbi Eliezer says the following things on this list. If you do them on Shabbat unintentionally, what happens? Remember, you get karet if it's on purpose, and skila, and you also get, if it's unintentional, then you have to bring a korban chatat, a sin offering. That means only things that are forbidden by Torah law, you have to bring a korban chatat. So therefore, it's a korban chatat. Now, they say, if you're hezi b'yom tov, if you do it intentionally on Yom Tov, you're going to get 40 lashes. Again, this all means it's doraita. It's forbidden by Torah law. So what are these things? Mechabed is to sweep the floors. Remember, it doesn't mean like sweeping floors like our floors, but sweeping floors that have dirt and grass, it was just sandy kind of floors. So sweeping the floors, and merabetz, which is they would throw water on it to have the dust settle. That's forbidden by Torah law. Okay, and rodeh chalot dvash is taking out the honeycomb from the beehive. So all those things are deoraita according to Rabbi Eliezer. According to the rabbis, these are only rabbinic in nature. So according to this, the machloket, what happened in the temple was that the Kohanim, according to this explanation of Rav Chisda, were holding like the rabbis. And when it said the rabbis were not pleased with him, it only meant those who held by Rabbi Eliezer's approach that it was forbidden by Torah law. But comes Rav Ashi and he says, no. Rav Ashi amar afilu tema shelo b'ratzon chachamim. He says, no, maybe shelo b'ratzon chachamim is really the rabbis. Even the rabbis who said it was forbidden by rabbinic law still didn't think that you could do this in the temple. And what would the reason be? The reason is according to Rabbi Natan. The Rabbi Natan, he Tanya, Rabbi Natan omer, shvut tzricha itiru, shvut she'ena tzricha lo itiru. Even though we say that we override rabbinic prohibitions on Shabbat in the temple, that's only if it's necessary. Now, was this necessary? And maybe that's part of the question, right? But theoretically, yes, it's all full of blood, but it doesn't matter. You can still do the avoda with the blood. It's not, it's maybe bothering you visually. You don't want blood in the temple, but there's nothing that's preventing you from continuing to work in the temple when there's blood on the floor. So therefore, it's not a necessary rabbinic prohibition to override. So even if you hold it's only a rabbinic prohibition, still you wouldn't necessarily say that it's permitted. Now we're going to get to more about this blood. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kos hayam emaleh. If you remember, Rabbi Yehuda would take a cup, he would scoop up some blood that was on the floor. Now we're going to see that they had, I talked about this yesterday, there was a channel, right? There was a hole in the ground, and the channel led all the liquids that were on the temple floor, they would drain out. It was like a drainage pipe. But they would, what we call pokakim, they would stick, cork it up or, put a plug in so that the blood would remain in the area, which according to Rabbi Yehuda is going to make perfect sense. We're going to have to see why, according to the rabbis who don't agree with Rabbi Yehuda about this, they did it. Rabbi Yehuda wanted all the blood to collect so that, we talked about this yesterday, that if, what would happen, somebody's blood spilled and it didn't get poured, now he would take a cup, with it would be mixed all the bloods that were circulating around, because the assumption is liquids are always moving. Again, this doesn't fully, in a realistic plane, you can't assume just because you pick up one bowl full of blood, it's going to have a bit of every single sacrifice in there. But there's an assumption he makes here. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kos hayam emaleh midamat ha'arovot. Here's a brayta that explains it better. He would pick up from all the mixture of all the bloods, that if by accident one of the bloods from one of the sacrifices had spilled and didn't get sprinkled on the altar or didn't get thrown on the altar, now we pick it up right now and we throw this on the altar. So, Amru lo Rabbi Yehuda, the rabbi said, what are you doing here? They said to him, but you can't take blood straight from the animal and put it on the altar. It has to go into a kli. It has to go into one of those bezichim. And this never went into a bezich. We're assuming, okay, this is an interesting assumption, but they're assuming that where the blood spilled, we must be talking about blood that never got collected in a cup. If that's the case, you can't just put it on the altar. There's a process. It has to go into a kli sharei. We've talked about this before, that when you put something into one of these holy dishes, something that's sanctified, it becomes sanctified, and then you bring the blood to, right, remember there's Kabbalah, you have to catch it in a kli. Then you walk it to the altar. So if this spilled straight onto the floor, you can't just take it straight and put it. Now, theoretically you're putting it in a kli right now, but I think the assumption is that once it fell on the floor, it's already disqualified. Right? If you didn't put it straight in a kli, it's disqualified because it fell on the floor. Think about it, right? You can't start sanctifying something that you collect from the ground. It has to be sanctified before that. So what does he say? Minayada. One second. Amrulo halolins kababakli. So minayade. How do you know that? Elahachi kamerlash. Right. Shema lonit kabel bekli. He says, how do you know it wasn't put in a kli? Maybe it was accepted in a kli, and then it fell from there. Amar lahen, afani lo amarti ela benit kabel bekli. In other words, I think I'm reading this wrong. 1 second. Halonit kabel bekli mina yade elahachi kamerle shema lonit kabel bekli. Right. So he said, sorry. So they said it wasn't accepted in a kli. So he said, Minayade, how do you know it wasn't accepted in a kli? So they said, no, what they really meant to say, it's not Rabbi Yehuda, it's the Gemara saying, what do you mean? How do you know it wasn't accepted in a kli? Maybe it was. So they said to him, Shema lo nitkabel b'kli. Maybe, in other words, you have to be worried about the possibility that maybe it didn't go into a kli. Amar lahen, so he says to them, Afani lo amarti ela b'nitkabel b'kli. So he says, no, I was talking about blood that was in a kli and then spilled on the floor. So then they say, Minayada, how do you know that you're not talking about blood that fell straight on the ground? So he says, Kohanim zlizin him. I know because the Kohanim are standing there. Remember we described 2 rows of Kohanim. All the Israelim were in the middle, slaughtering their animals. Next to every animal is a Kohen ready to get the blood. It's not that we're worried that the blood never went into a kli. Of course it went into a kli. What are we worried about? That it spilled. So of course, what are they going to ask him now? If the Kohanim are Zrizim and they're so careful, right? Now, this is an interesting, Zrizim means, sort of means careful. It also means they're zealous about what they're doing and they're very excited about it. So if they're very zealous, well, they're going to be very careful and they're going to make sure to catch all the blood. So they say, Izrizin, amay mishtapich. So if they're so careful, why did it spill? So here's the classic, Agav zrizutayu da'avde mishtapich. Because they're so overly excited about it and they're passing those cups very quickly that, part of this reason is being quick and they want to get things done quickly and efficiently. But sometimes when you're quick about things, think about when you're passing cups very quickly, though blood could spill over. So on the one hand, we're not worried that they didn't catch blood. They for sure caught blood into cups. But now the issue is that we're concerned that in their hurry, they spilled. Like this is one of these issues always about being overly excited about something or overly zealous, or you can think about Nadav and Avihu, same thing, right? They had good intentions, but they went too far with it, right? And they didn't do it in the proper way. And you have to make sure, right, when you do things, do it in a moderate way. On the one hand, you want to be zrizin, on the other hand, you have to be careful. Okay. There is a question here, and I don't have a good answer. I see you're asking, and I also had this question, which is, doesn't the blood need to be done for the purpose of that particular korban? And I'm not sure about this because this certainly seems to indicate not, because clearly you don't know which korban. And someone asked it yesterday, if they're passing the cups, right, how do they know when the Kohen sprinkles the blood or throws the blood, how does he know which korban he's doing it for? And I'm not clear on whether it has to be done with the right purpose. There, when they're passing the cups, theoretically, as they're passing the cup, they could say a name of which group and pass the name down. Theoretically, it could work. It's a little bit complicated, but I could see one doing that. Here, clearly, you'd have to say, I'm doing this, and maybe this is what we call b'di'evet. You have no choice. In other words, you're doing this just to be on the safe side, and ideally, you're supposed to do it for the name of that korban, but maybe b'di'evet, it doesn't have to work. So anyway, it's a question I don't have an answer to. I'm not sure if it actually has to be done, because if you think about it, we talked about before, the one who's zorek, if people have chametz at home, he's liable. That makes it sound like he knows which korban he's sprinkling the blood for. Anyway, it's a question I don't have a good answer to. So now, we have some more questions here. But now we have a separate question. Okay, so we resolved what happened. The blood went into a bowl, then it spilled on the floor. So since it was already sanctified before it spilled on the floor, we can take it and we can put it on the altar. Now we have a separate problem. The problem is there's different bloods mixed in here now. And what's the percentage of blood right now? So we have a little bit of blood on the floor that probably spilled from these bowls. Okay, and what we're concerned about is maybe we had a bowl that was entirely dumped out by accident, and dumped on the floor. Now we have another issue, which is most of the blood that's on the floor in the temple right now is coming from the slaughtering of the animal. Now, if you remember, we talked about there's different types of blood. The first is that big spurt of blood that comes out, and that's where we take the blood that goes into this bazich, this bowl or cup that we're talking about. But the next blood that comes out after the big spurt of blood is called damatamtsit. That's not the main type of blood. And that's most of the blood that's on the ground here, which is all the blood that comes out after that big spurt of blood. That's called damatamtsit. So they say, and if you think about it, like, let's try to play a percentage game. Probably 95% of the blood on the ground is all the blood that streamed out of the animals after you slaughter the damatamtsit. 5% of the blood, let's just say, is the blood that we want to sprinkle on the altar. So regular laws of bitul, right, nullification, you would call this damatamtsit. You wouldn't call it blood. And then we're going to say, can you put damatamtsit? In other words, if it's really mostly damatamtsit and we want to offer that on the altar, that's not the blood that we are supposed to offer on the altar. So they say, halo damatamtsit mu'urav bo, and not only mu'urav bo, but the majority of it is damatamtsit. So Rabbi Yehuda l'ta'ameh ta'amar damatamtsit dama'al yehu. Rabbi Yehuda goes, he's consistent with what Rabbi Yehuda says elsewhere, which is he holds. Now, this is not exactly elsewhere. This is in a different topic. There's two issues about blood mainly that come up in the Torah, or at least that we're going to discuss right now. One is dam is supposed to be the part you put on the altar. Number two, we have the issue of it's forbidden to eat blood. These two things are often connected. I'll give you another example, the chaylev, that we can't eat the forbidden fats of animals. When we slaughter a regular animal, that's also the part that we burn on the altar. So there's this connection between them. But the question is how far a connection, how close a connection is there? How direct a connection? So basically, when it comes to eating blood, it's forbidden to eat blood, and you get karet if you eat blood. There's a debate, what if, is this only the blood, that big spurt of blood that would come out of an animal when you slaughter it, or is it even damatamtsit, the blood that comes out after? So we're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda holds damatamtsit is forbidden just like the other kind of blood. And therefore, we're going to assume if he says it's forbidden, like all other bloods, then he considers this blood, and it would be the same thing for blood that goes on the altar. Ditanya, damatamtsit ba'azhara. So according to Tanakama, damatamtsit is only forbidden, meaning there's a lo taseh in the Torah, but you don't get karet for it. For Rabbi Yehuda omer bi karet. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you get karet for it. So now, there you see it. Rabbi Yehuda holds that damatamtsit is forbidden by Torah law to eat, and therefore we're assuming it would be the same thing, that you could put damatamtsit on the altar. But they say that doesn't work, because Hama Rabbi Elazar, who's the Amora of Rabbi Elazar, you always have to stress which one, you always have to point out which one he is. He's an Amora from Israel. He said, Modeh Rabbi Yehuda linyan kapara she'eino mechaper. He says that Rabbi Yehuda agrees, even though he says that when you eat it, these are two different things, right? I set them up as if they're the same, although I kind of indicated that maybe there would be a difference. He says that if you have damatamtsit and you want to put it on the altar, that does not provide you with atonement. Shenema, why is that? Because the verse there says, Ki adam hu banefesh yechaper, because the blood in the soul is what atones for you. How do they darshan that? Dam shahanefesh yotzabo mechaper. Dam she'ena nefesh yotzabo eno mechaper. Only blood that brings out the soul of the animal, meaning that causes the animal to die. Once the big spurt of blood is done, you can't use that blood on the altar. So we're back to square one. How could Rabbi Yehuda allow you to take this big mixture, which is mainly damatamtsit, and you're using that to atone? Doesn't make any sense. So Ela Rabbi Yehuda l'ta'ameh, and that's why I brought up laws of nullification, because you're going to see he goes according to his own approach, which we learned already before, damar ein dam mevatel dam. Remember, we had this big debate when it came to nullification. Do laws of nullification apply when you have two of the same type? There's a big debate, right? Does it only work when you have two different types and therefore one kind of overpowers the other? But if they're two of the same type, then one doesn't really get absorbed in the other. It's the same thing, and it's not considered nullified. And where did they learn that from? I'll remind you. And every time we learn it, well, I'll remind you, and hopefully you'll get it, which is dam hapar and the dam seir. When the Kohen Gadol goes on Yom Kippur, he has the dam from the seir and the dam of the par, and the par is the bull. It's a much bigger animal. And it calls them in the Torah, the dam hapar and the dam seir, even though he puts them together. And even though there's a lot more blood from the bull than there is from the goat, and yet it overpowered, right? It doesn't overpower it. We still call it the blood of the goat. And therefore, we see that ein dam mevatel dam, and not only ein dam mevatel dam, any two things that are the same type don't nullify each other. So therefore, even if it's only 5% from the sacrifices, still we can say, right, from the blood that can be used on the altar, if we take this whole thing, right, there's no problem of throwing the blood damatamtzit on the altar. It's right, as long as we have a little bit from the sacrifices, that can provide us with atonement. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda is consistent with his approach about no laws of nullification. And that's why it doesn't matter that there's damatamtzit mixed in. Okay, next issue. Still on this blood issue, Tanya, Amar Lahem Rabbi Yehuda Chachamim, I told you that they would put a stopper into the hole so that the blood didn't come out. So Rabbi Yehuda says to the rabbis, L'divrechem lama pokekin et hazara. For me, I understand why we stop up where we put we block up the hole, because we want the blood to collect so that if by accident blood spilled and it didn't get put on the altar, we can collect it at the end and put it on the altar. But according to you, why did they do this? Amru lo, shevachu lebnei Aaron. Ruth said this after class yesterday. Sheilchu adar kubotehem badam. It's the Kohanim. It's their biggest. How would you say? Right? Shevach is praise, but it's almost like this is their glory that they get to walk around with their knees knee deep in blood. Okay, that's an amazing. It's an honor for them. Okay, to walk around with their knees in blood, and that's why. Now we're going to talk about this knees and blood thing. This is a little bit problematic. Okay, we talk about it as if this is an amazing thing, but this causes all sorts of issues, halachic issues. So what are the halachic issues? The first problem is hakachayitz. There's a chatzitza, which is a separation between their feet and the ground because there's blood there. And we know the Kohanim walked around barefoot because there's not allowed to be any sort of separation between their feet and the ground in the temple. So how can you, this is a chatzitza. So how could they be walking around to their knees in blood? So they say, lahu ve'eno chotzetz. Oh, it's liquidy. Since it's liquidy, that doesn't create a separation, a barrier. Kidditanya, as we see in the following braita, hadam v'hadyo v'hachalav v'hadvash. If you have blood or ink or milk or honey, yiveshim chotzetzim, if they're dry, then they create a barrier. Lachin ein chotzetzim, but if they're liquidy, they don't create a separation. So there you have it. So no problem of chatzitza. But now we have a separate problem, and we talked about this yesterday. How, all their clothes were obviously going to get dirty with blood. This is actually a problem. If they go up to their knees in blood, if you remember, they wore this long coat that they wore, or the beget, one of their begadim, the Kohanim's clothing that they wore, was this long thing that went to the ground. So hakamit vase manayu, but their clothes got all dirty, full of, if you go up to your knees in blood, the whole bottom of their cloaks are going to be full of blood. Tanya, and it says in a braita, if the Kohen's clothes get dirty and he works anyway, whatever he does is disqualified. So how could they be walking around with their knees in blood, with their cloaks to the ground? Their clothes were going to get dirty, and now they can't do it. You might say, what's obvious? If they're going to go up to their knees in blood, what will they do? They'll lift up their cloaks, right? They'll pick it up. That's not going to work. How do we know it's not going to work? Because it started with the words v'chitema. V'chitema means if you're going to say, you know that they're going to say that's not going to work. If you're going to say they picked up their clothes, v'hatanya, it says in a braita, midobad, that's the words that describe the cloak that they're wearing. Mido, they say kim midato. The word midah comes from measuring. According to their measurement is the drasha. Shelo yechaser v'lo yotir. Basically, their cloaks are supposed to be worn, not just that they're supposed to be fit that way, but they're supposed to be worn exactly the right way. No longer than, and as everyone had it tailor-made, custom-made, exactly their height, no longer, no shorter, and it went to the ground. So it can't be, they had to wear their cloaks the way they are. They couldn't pick them up. So what do they say? Well, maybe not when they were doing the main service. They had to leave their cloaks down. But, maybe when they brought the parts of the animal to the ramp of the altar. Now, this is, you have to understand evarim. Evarim, usually, this sounds like what they would do with a korban ola, where they would take all the parts of the animal that all got burnt on the altar. So you'd have to change this a little. Some comment that it's the wrong nusach. It should be imurim, right? The parts that get burnt of the korban pesach, when they would walk them to the ramp, which is not part of the main avodah, right? Walking the blood to the altar is part of the work. But walking the parts they're supposed to get burnt on the altar, that's not. At that moment, they would walk up to their knees in blood. Okay, I know you're probably thinking, I don't understand. So then they walked in their knees. If it was knee height, right? How did they only walk in the up to the where the blood was up to their knees when they were walking to the ramp? We'll get back to that soon. Okay, that's the obvious question here, but we'll only get to that later. So now they say, so basically, it must be that they would, that you have to wear your beged to the floor while you're doing the main work. But when you're walking the stuff to the ramp, the parts that have to get burned to the ramp of the altar, you can walk and lift the bottom of your cloak. Okay, it's a little complicated how they did that while they're also carrying the parts, but let's assume it's not so bad. So now, thank you for commenting that Gita says the Kohen says it's their ankles. So maybe it's their ankles. I always thought our kavod are their knees, but maybe there's different interpretations, or maybe I'm wrong. In any case, they say, so walking the Evarim is lav avodahi, so they could do it then. But now they say, below, it's not avodah. That is also avodah. Now, remember we said there's 4 main avodot, and this comes up all the time. What's the status of the other ones? Yes, there are other avodot. It's not like there's only 4. There's 4 main ones, but there's also other ones, and the whole question is, what type of avodah are they considered? So now the Gemara says, well, this must be avodah because ha'ami debai kehuna avodahi. Since it can only be done by a kohen, it must be considered avodah. There's this assumption that if only the kohen can do it, that must be calling it that's why it's called an avodah. How do we know that only a kohen can do it? Titania, the kriva kohena takolam mizbecha, and the kohen. Now, when we say hikriv can mean 2 things. It can mean he brought it close, right? He brought everything to the mizbeach, or it could mean he sacrificed the whole thing on the altar. But because it says elsewhere that he burns it, therefore they assume this doesn't mean he burnt it. So the drasha is zoho lachate v'rim lakevesh. It said in those verses, hikrivu comes up a bunch of times. And like I said, hikrivu could be he brought it close, and that's how they understand hikrivu here, that he brought it there, which means that since he carries this to the altar and only a kohen can do it, that makes it avodah. That means he can't be lifting up his cloak when he does that. So therefore, they give a different answer. It must be while they were walking the wood, they had to always bring wood to fill up the wood that was used to burn on the altar. That's not avodah, because even though the Kohanim do it because no one else is allowed there, but the assumption is that they would bring the wood. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah the Kohanim have to bring the wood. It's just not something they talk about in the Torah even. So therefore, that we can assume is not avodah. And therefore, we're now assuming when it says they were up to their ankles or knees in blood, it must have meant when they were walking the wood to the altar. So now the obvious question, but they were doing other things at the time. They were walking the parts to the altar, which we just said they can't do while they're lifting their cloaks, and they were bringing the blood to the altar to sprinkle the blood. So if they're doing all that, how are they walking? If it's up to their ankles in blood, how on earth are they walking around with their cloaks getting dirty? In other words, that doesn't resolve the problem. So demaska itztebe. They assumed they were walking on these low, right? They had low pillars, little short beams, and they walked on those. Okay, so they had to basically walk from one to the other, and they didn't actually walk on the ground to ensure that their cloaks didn't get dirty. Okay, unclear how they didn't get dirty from blood spraying on them and other issues. Maybe this is just more of an issue because it would be a lot of blood, whereas just a little blood maybe is less problematic. Anyway, the whole thing is a good question. Exactly the reality of this. You can see that the Gemara is struggling with the reality of this, right? And maybe blood wasn't really such a problem, but in the eyes of the Amoraim, how could it possibly be, right? How could it possibly be that this is, that this went on and there was blood on their clothes? But it could be that in the temple that wasn't such an issue. Maybe blood wasn't considered dirt, right? It was part of the korban, almost like you're proud to have blood on your clothes. But clearly the sugya here views this as problematic and having a whole discussion about it. But again, interesting that they're having this discussion once there's no longer a temple, right? It's different having this conversation after the destruction than actually during the discussion. Okay, you're asking why the pillar is not a chatzitza. I assume that's because it's attached to the floor and it's just considered part of the ground. That's how I assume it. And I think right, exactly. I think what Tov is saying, which is, I think from what I remember, it's very low to the ground. Okay, obviously not low enough, which would maybe explain why it's ankles and not knees. And then it's within 3 tvachim of the ground, and then it's just considered part of the ground itself. That's what I seem to remember. Okay, next part. We have 2 more little sections before we finish the chapter. Ketzad tolinu mafshitim. Okay, and really the main part is not this, but they flay the hide, if you remember. Kra'ovo tziu et imulav. Right, then they take out the inner parts. Those are the parts that have to be burned on the altar. That's why they take off the hide. Nitanam b'megis laktiram. Now they put them in this bowl, this bigger bowl, much bigger than the basich. The megis is a big bowl, and they put the innards in there in order to burn them on the altar. Now, there's 2 ways to read this question in the Gemara. I'll read it one way, and then I'll read it a second way. Atu hu gufe hava miktar lehu. It says they would take out the imurim in order, and the way they read it right now is in order for him to burn it. In other words, the person who takes it out is the one who burns it on the altar. So they're saying it has to be the person who takes it out is he's the one who has to burn it. So they say ema lahaktiran al gabei mizbeach. They say no. It means lehaktiram, which means you take it out in order for it to be burned, not that you actually have to burn it. It's not the greatest question because they're not changing the wording. They're really just saying lehaktiram is what it says. So it seems a little bit weird why they thought lahaktiram meant that he himself has to do it is a little bit questionable, which is why it leads to a different interpretation. Some people read it as they put it in the megis, lahaktiram in the megis. In other words, you put it in the bowl in order to burn it there in the bowl. To which they ask, Atuhu gufe hava miktar lehu. They had to put it in the bowl to burn. Now, don't you burn it on the altar, not in a bowl? So they say, and that's why they add the words here, Ema laktiran al gabei mizbeach. Now the mizbeach becomes relevant. The mizbeach wasn't so important the first rereading, but now they say, oh, it's so that he burns it on the altar. You put it in the bowl to carry it there and then bring it to the altar. Both readings have issues with them, and that's why there's 2 different readings, and it's not clear which is the right reading. Yatzda kat rishona. Now we get to the end where basically what did they do when it was Pesach? It fell out, Erev Pesach, it fell on Shabbat. They would basically, right, they would each wait, and then when Shabbat ended, they would carry their animals home. So there's a braita about this. Tana kol echad ve'echad noten pischo ba'oro u'mafshil achorav. They would take the hide that they took off the animal, and they would use it, right? They often made bags out of leather, right, like we do nowadays, pocketbooks. So they would wrap it in the hide of the animal and kind of throw it over their shoulder. Amar Rav Elish, tayaut. Rav Elish says this is like, and Rashi says, what did it mean tayaut? Taya comes up in the Latin Gemara. It always means an Arab merchant, okay? Like the Arab merchants do, okay? What's he adding? Is he just describing? Maybe. Some people say he's showing that even though normally we don't carry our wares like the Arab merchants, here we do it, and we don't, like, we're so happy to do the mitzvah, so we carry it kind of in our way of showing we're so happy to do this mitzvah. It doesn't matter that we're embarrassing ourselves, maybe looking like we're carrying it in a particular way, right? We're just happy to be doing our mitzvah. Okay, Hadron alach tamid nishchat, and with that, we're going to start the next chapter. Thank you for everyone's research. I see the knees. Some people say, the Schottenstein says the knees, the Steinsaltz says the ankles. There's obviously some different interpretations. Okay. Elu dvarim bepesach dochin et haShabbat. Now we're going to have a machloket in this Mishnah about what happens when, okay, we started this issue already, when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbat. So these are the things that override Shabbat. Shchitato, slaughtering. Zrikato, okay, shchita is clearly usher to do on Shabbat. Zrikatamo, sprinkling the blood, or throwing the blood on the altar. Okay, big question. What's forbidden about this? So Tosfot says nothing's forbidden about this. It's not really, you didn't even have to list this, but since they said shchita, they said zrika. Okay, they always kind of go together. It's a little bit strange. Some Mefarshim explain, no, zrika is the final part of the korban. It's like tikkun, right? Like the makeh bepatish. So that's what fixes you, right? If you have a korban, the zrika gives you the atonement, and therefore it's like fixing. So that could be the issue. Another explanation is maybe it's muktzah, and that's the issue. In any case, shrita zrika michoy kravav. The innards part of the animal had a lot of excrement in there. So you had to clean that out. Now that's a toladav dash. It's like taking the wheat from the chaff. Haktarat chalavav is burning the fats on the altar, right? That's a fire and burning things. That's obviously forbidden. All those things are allowed. Okay, the first category of things that are allowed because you have to do that, right? Those are central parts of the sacrifice. Anything that could wait or could have been done yesterday are not allowed. Aval, sliato, roasting it. Hadachat chavav, once you took out the main excrement, then you want to wash it off. That's already also a problem. It's borer, and it's not as crucial, right? It's not as disgusting. Once you got off the main stuff, it's not so bad anymore. Those can be pushed off till after Shabbat. Harkavato, v'hava'ato michutz latchum, v'chatichat yabalto. And most say that these are all derabbanans. Before the first two were deoraita, and now we're talking about derabbanans. Carrying it when the animal is still alive and bringing the animal to the temple. We have this concept, if you remember, we had a machloket. Is chayno se'et atzmo, that a live person can carry himself. Does that mean, and then therefore carrying a live person is only derabbanan? Would that apply also to animals? So this would say, yes, it does. And that's why this is only rabbinic in nature. Or bringing it michutz latchum, which we saw many opinions said tchum is only derabbanan, rabbinic. V'chatichat yabalto, cutting off a yabelet, which would make it a moon, like to basically take that off so that you could sacrifice it. Ein dochin et Shabbat. Those are things that you could have done before. Rabbi Eliezer Omer dochin. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and says these actually do override Shabbat. Now, often we have a case where there's a machloket in the Mishnah, and then we bring it to a Sefta where there's a conversation going back and forth. This is a rare case where happens here and there, where the Mishnah has a whole conversation going back and forth between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. So Rabbi Eliezer thinks that these things all override Shabbat, and Tanakama thinks not. So Amar Rabbi Eliezer, v'halodinhu. It's very logical. I can make you a kavachomer argument. Ma'im shchita shehi mishum malacha dochet Shabbat. If shchita is doraita and it overrides Shabbat, elu shehi mishum shvut. Your second list, harkavto v'havato mechutz latchum and chatichat yabalto, which are only derabbanan in nature. Lo yitchu et Shabbat. You think those aren't going to override Shabbat? If they're derabbanan, of course they're going to override Shabbat. If your do'oraitas override, then obviously they're derabbanans. Amar le Rabbi Yoshua, and yes, so Gita, thank you for pointing out. Rabbi Eliezer does have a similar opinion with Milah. He thinks machshirei Milah or dochim et Shabbat. Anything that's getting things ready is also allowed to override Shabbat. Big debate. This is the same debate. Amar le Rabbi Eliezer. Amar le Rabbi Yoshua. Yom Tov mochiach. I'll give you proof. Just because we override do'oraitas doesn't mean we override derabbanans, other derabbanans. Yom Tov is a great example. She tiru bo mishum malacha. On Yom Tov, we all know you can cook on Yom Tov. So I can I can transfer fire, I can cook food. That's all usher to do on Shabbat. It's usher midoraita, and yet we allow it because of ochel nefesh. V'asur bo mishum shvut. But if I want some food on Yom Tov and it's outside the tchum, we don't say, oh, go get your food from outside the tchum and bring it in. We don't allow that. We allow cooking, but we don't allow you to do something that you could have done yesterday and bring your food from far away. That's not allowed. So there you see. Just because we override do'oraita doesn't mean we override also any derabbanans that you could have done some other time. Amarle Rabbi Eliezer, Mazi Yoshua, Maraya Reshut l'mitzvah. What kind of proof are you bringing? He says, you're bringing proof from Reshut. This is, do I want to eat something on Yom Tov? That's not a mitzvah, but I'm giving you from the world of the temple and mitzvot. And here you want to do your Korban Pesach and you didn't bring your animal. Of course you should be allowed to bring it. Heshiv Rabbi Akiva. Here, notice Rabbi Yeshua switches with Rabbi Akiva now. Rabbi Akiva starts answering him back. Haza'at tochiach, I'll prove it to you from the mechatat. This is, you're not allowed to sprinkle the purification waters on someone who's a tameh, like a tameh maid, on their seventh day. You're supposed to sprinkle them. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat because it's, again, fixing. Okay, it's a problem. You're kind of fixing someone. So that's a problem on Shabbat. So he says, I'll prove it from the mechatat. Now Rashi says, let's say you're on the seventh day and your seventh day falls out on Erev Pesach and you're supposed to sprinkle so that you can now do the Korban Pesach. So Rabbi Akiva says you're not allowed to do that because if it falls out on Shabbat, it's a problem. So he says, I'll prove it to you. It's a mitzvah to be able to do the Korban Pesach. And it's only D'Rabbanan because you're just, it looks like you're fixing. It's not exactly, it's not the same thing as Makeh Patish. Remember, Makeh Patish is doing the final blow on whatever utensil you're creating. That's different. That's kind of turning something from not usable to usable. So this is turning a person into not being able to do a korban to you doing, but it's only rabbinic in nature. So he says, and it's not Tochesh Shabbat. And look, you can't do that on Shabbat. Afatal titmal elu. So don't be questioning these. So why are you questioning these things? They also shouldn't override Shabbat. Okay, you see here, D'Rabbanans don't necessarily override Shabbat to allow you to do the Korban Pesach. So, interesting response of Rabbi Eliezer. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, va'aleha ani dan. I disagree with you on exactly this issue. I think that you brought me a proof from the sprinkling of the purification waters that you say you can't do. I think that if you're standing on Erev Pesach, you can do those purification waters because it's only rabbinic and it's allowing you to do the Korban Pesach. So you're using a proof of something that's your opinion, but I disagree about that. So he says, I'd add that one to the list. I think that also you can sprinkle the waters in order to enable you to do the Korban Pesach, just like you can slaughter. If you can slaughter, which is Doraita, of course you can sprinkle the waters, which is only rabbinic in nature. Fortunately, we're going to have to stop in the middle of this whole discussion between them because the Mishnah continues well into the next page. So we'll stop here for today. Have a great day, everyone.